Imagine walking through a crowded medieval town at dawn. The streets are narrow. Stone houses lean toward each other like tired giants. Smoke curls from low chimneys. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer strikes iron with a dull, rhythmic clang. And according to one of the most common myths about the Middle Ages, the smell here should be unbearable. People often imagine medieval life as a world where nobody bathed for months, sometimes even years. A time when kings, peasants, soldiers, and merchants all lived in layers of sweat and filth, afraid that water itself might bring disease. But here's the question historians began asking more seriously in recent years. Was medieval Europe really that dirty? Or have we misunderstood the past completely? Because when you begin digging into records from the Middle Ages, household accounts, city laws, traveler journals, even church writings, you start to find something unexpected. People talked about bathing a lot. In fact, in many medieval cities, bathing wasn't rare at all. It was normal. To understand why the myth of the filthy Middle Ages became so powerful, we first have to step back and look at daily life in Europe around the 12th and 13th centuries. Picture a town like Paris, London, or Cologne. Water flows through public fountains. Rivers cut through the heart of the city. And scattered among bakeries, taverns, and workshops, you would also find bathhouses. Public bathhouses were surprisingly common across medieval Europe. Some were simple wooden buildings with large, heated tubs. Others were elaborate establishments where visitors could soak in warm water, relax, eat food, and socialize. In some cities, bathhouses were so popular that entire streets became known for them. Records from medieval Paris mention dozens of public baths operating at the same time. And these weren't places reserved for the rich. Craftsmen, merchants, laborers, and travelers all used them. A hot bath was not just about cleaning the body. It was about comfort, about warmth during long, cold winters, and sometimes about community. People sat together in wooden tubs, talking about trade, gossiping about neighbors, or simply enjoying the rare luxury of warm water. Of course, medieval bathing didn't look exactly like modern hygiene. Soap existed, but it was often rough and made from animal fat and ash. Towels were coarse linen, and water sometimes had to be heated over fires before it could fill the tubs. But the idea that medieval people avoided bathing entirely, that's far from the truth. In fact, many medieval texts describe bathing as healthy and even necessary. Medical writers believed warm baths could relax the body, improve circulation, and help balance the body's internal humors. Knights returning from long journeys were advised to bathe. Travelers stopping at inns often expected access to a wash basin or bath. Even kings and nobles had servants prepare bathing chambers filled with heated water. So if bathing existed, if bathhouses were common, and if people clearly cared about cleanliness, then where did the idea come from that medieval people almost never washed? The answer lies in a strange twist of history, because over time, something happened that slowly changed how Europeans thought about bathing. And by the late Middle Ages, attitudes toward water, cleanliness, and the human body would begin to shift in ways no one had expected. But to understand that change, We first have to step inside one of those medieval bathhouses, and what happened inside them might surprise you. Step inside a medieval bathhouse on a cold evening. Outside, the streets are damp and dim. Lanterns flicker against stone walls, and the smell of smoke hangs in the winter air. But behind the wooden door of the bathhouse, the world feels completely different. Warmth. Steam drifts slowly through the room. Large wooden tubs sit in rows filled with heated water carried from great iron cauldrons over open fires. The air smells faintly of soap, herbs, and wet wood. People talk. Some laugh loudly. Others sit quietly, letting the heat soak into tired muscles after a long day of work. This wasn't a rare scene. In many medieval towns, visiting a bathhouse was part of normal life. Travelers described them across Europe, from the German cities of the Holy Roman Empire to the crowded streets of Paris and London. Some bathhouses were modest buildings run by a single family. Others were bustling businesses with attendants who heated water, served food, and even offered massages. A visitor might pay a small fee, receive a linen cloth, and climb into a wooden tub filled with warm water. After weeks of cold weather or dusty travel, the experience could feel luxurious. But medieval bathhouses were not only about hygiene. They were social spaces. Friends met there. Business deals were discussed. Travelers exchanged news from distant towns. In some places, bathhouses even served food and drink, turning the experience into something closer to a relaxed evening gathering. Imagine sitting in a tub while someone nearby passes a wooden cup of ale across the room. Steam rises. Conversations echo softly through the building. Outside, the city grows darker. For a moment, life slows down. Yet these bathhouses also carried a reputation that made some authorities uneasy, because where warm water, relaxation, and privacy existed, other activities sometimes followed. Some bathhouses quietly developed connections with prostitution. Not all of them, but enough that city officials and church leaders began to worry about what was happening inside these steamy rooms. Records from several medieval cities mention regulations attempting to control bathhouse behavior. Certain establishments were ordered to close at night. Others were inspected to ensure they were not secretly operating as brothels. Still, the baths remained popular. For centuries, people continued to wash, soak, and socialize in these public bathing spaces. So what changed? Why did later generations begin believing that medieval people rarely bathed? The turning point came during a time of fear, a time when disease spread across Europe with terrifying speed. In the 14th century, a catastrophe arrived that reshaped nearly every aspect of life. The Black Death. When the plague swept through cities and villages, killing millions, people desperately searched for explanations. Doctors and religious authorities offered theories about how the disease spread, and some of those theories focused on water. Certain medical writers began warning that hot baths opened the pores of the body, and if the pores were open, deadly air, what they called miasma, could enter the body more easily. Suddenly, something that once symbolized comfort and cleanliness began to seem dangerous. Bathhouses that had once been filled with laughter and conversation started to close. Doors that had stood open for generations were quietly shut. And slowly, a new belief began to grow across Europe. Maybe bathing too often wasn't safe after all. But the real story of medieval hygiene doesn't end there. Because even as public baths disappeared, people did not simply abandon cleanliness. Instead, they adapted in ways that reveal a very different reality of medieval life, one that challenges the stereotype of a filthy, unwashed world. By the late Middle Ages, many public bathhouses had closed their doors. Fear of disease, stricter religious attitudes, and growing suspicion around bathhouse culture slowly pushed them out of everyday life in many cities. What had once been lively social spaces faded into memory. And this is where the myth truly begins. Because when later generations looked back at the medieval world after bathhouses disappeared, they assumed people must have simply stopped caring about cleanliness. But that assumption misses something important. Even without public baths, medieval people still washed, just not always in the way we imagine today. Step inside a typical medieval home. It's early morning, light slips through a small window. A wooden table sits near the wall, and beside it rests a ceramic basin filled with water. A jug stands nearby, along with a cloth made of coarse linen. This was the medieval equivalent of a sink. Every morning, people washed their faces and hands using these basins. It was such a common habit that many household inventories from the period list wash bowls and pitchers as standard items. Guests arriving at a home were often offered water to wash before eating. At noble banquets, servants even walked along the tables, pouring water over guests' hands into silver bowls before meals began. Clean hands weren't just polite, they were expected. Clothing also played a major role in medieval hygiene. Unlike modern wardrobes, medieval people relied heavily on linen undergarments, simple shirts worn beneath outer clothing. Linen absorbed sweat and oils from the body, acting almost like a removable layer of cleanliness. These garments were washed frequently, sometimes far more often than the outer clothing people wore. Changing into fresh linen could make a person feel clean even without a full bath. Medical advice of the time often recommended exactly this: keep the body clean through fresh clothes, combed hair, and regular washing of exposed skin. Water wasn't avoided completely. Rivers, streams, and wooden tubs in private homes were still used for bathing, especially during warmer seasons. People might bathe less frequently than modern standards, but the idea that they never washed simply isn't supported by historical evidence. Travelers visiting medieval Europe often described people washing their hands before meals, grooming their hair, and keeping their clothing reasonably clean. Not perfect hygiene, but far from the stereotype of a society that lived in constant filth. So how did the myth become so powerful? Part of the answer lies in later centuries. During the 18th and 19th centuries, writers began portraying the Middle Ages as a dark and primitive time compared to modern civilization. Stories exaggerated the dirt, the smells, and the supposed ignorance of medieval life. Those images stuck. They appeared in books, films, and popular culture until the idea became almost unquestioned. But the historical reality is far more nuanced. Medieval people understood the value of cleanliness in the ways available to them. They washed their hands, they cleaned their clothes, they visited baths when possible. They adapted their habits when fears about disease changed society. In other words, they were human, trying to stay comfortable, healthy, and presentable in a world without plumbing, running hot water, or modern soap. So the next time someone says medieval people never bathed for years at a time, remember this: the truth of the past is rarely as simple or as dirty as the myths suggest.